Advanced Studio Classroom is on the air. Join us today as we talk about the keys to success. Hello, listeners. Welcome back to another Advanced Studio Classroom program. I'm your host for today. My name is Simon, and you're joining me for our July 2019 Leadership article. Today, we are looking at an article called Healthy Habits That Lead to Success. It's a 2-day article, and it's got 2 different lessons. So today's lesson focuses on 2 very famous, successful people. And one of the secrets that one of those people taught the other. Those 2 people are Warren Buffett and Bill Gates. Warren Buffett, of course, is a famous business person and investor, very famous for being very wealthy and very successful at that. And Bill Gates, of course, is also a successful business person, but in the tech industry. He is the person who started Microsoft along with a few other people. So today, our article is called Warren Buffett Taught Bill Gates a Simple Way to Manage Time. And before we get into discussing that, I want to introduce you to my 2 panelists for today. Manya, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Simon. I'm glad to be here.
Manya, it's good to have you back. And Pauline, it's nice to have you too.
Hey, Simon. It's always fun being on radio with you.
Now, I wanted to start with a question for you two, because this article specifically deals with the idea of how wealthy people or successful people manage their time. And I think a lot of different people have a lot of different ideas about what wealthy and successful people are actually doing, you know? Do they just inherit their wealth and then they spend their time by the pool? Do they work really hard every minute of every day to earn it? What exactly are wealthy or successful people doing to manage their time? So I thought I would ask you that question first. What do you think these successful people are doing, Manya?
Well, every wealthy person I know, and that's not a lot of people, but the ones that I do know, they're always spending their time socializing, I've noticed. We're talking to people and making connections and then sharing ideas and things like that.
So where are they doing this sort of thing?
Sometimes,
in coffee shops?
I don't know. Well, sometimes in parties, sometimes over the phone, sometimes I have no idea, honestly.
They're just always working their network.
Yeah,
okay.
I guess.
Okay, sounds good. How about you, Pauline? What do you think these successful people are doing?
Well, it's funny. When you ask me the question about successful people or wealthy people, I have 2 very different responses. And I guess successful people, depending on the type of success we're talking about, may be wealthy people, and wealthy people may be wealthy because they were successful, but I don't necessarily put them in the same category. If I hear wealthy, I just think of somebody who probably inherited the money, or I don't assume they got it from working hard and that they're really doing a lot to deserve that money. I feel like it just happened in one way or the other, and I assume a lot of negative qualities, which is probably not fair, but I tend to assume like a laziness and just like
poor rich people.
I kind of just assume that they are living a lavish lifestyle, enjoying life, and not really pouring a lot of themselves into work, or whether actual job work or philanthropic work, although that's not necessarily true. I know people like Warren Buffett does a lot of philanthropic work, and Bill Gates, actually, both of them. Meanwhile, successful people, you say successful, I think somebody who's worked really hard, has a high level of skill or intelligence in a certain area and has worked really hard to get to them to the point where they have become successful monetarily, maybe, and in whatever other way they're successful.
Okay, so you're basically saying you don't necessarily assume good things like hard work and being a self-made person about wealthy people, because you think of success and wealth as different things.
Right.
Like people who are successful might be successful without ever making a lot of money. Mm-hmm. And I think that's very fair. But I also think probably all three of us have a lot of biases about this sort of thing, meaning different points of view. And I think we probably have that largely because of where we grew up and the situations we grew up in. I know I grew up in a very small town, and one of the things my father used to do with my brother and I was wake us up really, really early, like well before 7 o'clock on Saturday mornings, and drag us to this local diner, which was, a diner's kind of, sometimes we call it a greasy spoon, like a restaurant where they fry a bunch of food and they sell food fairly cheaply. And we would sit at this big, long counter with all these other sort of self-made people, mostly men from the town who were there with their sons, really early in the morning, going over the newspaper and sort of chatting a bit. So it's interesting because my experience then shares a lot from your answer, Manya. Like, I found self-made, wealthier people to be very social. But I also found them to be very hardworking. They started work really early in the morning, and they were still going at 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock at night all the time. And so in my experience, most people who are successful, whether or not they're successful at making money or maybe doing other things like building an organization or achieving some other goals, they tend to be really hardworking people. And that's, I guess, just a different sort of perspective. But nonetheless, the research does suggest that people who are successful, and when we're talking about this here today, we won't necessarily be talking about being very wealthy, but we are generally talking about in a business sort of sense, people who are successful with their careers. They do tend to be very busy. They do tend to work longer hours than people who are less successful. And that's kind of the people we're going to talk about today. And so the idea is that because they are working so much, they have a lot of demands on their time, and time management becomes a very important issue. They sort of give a quick summary of that idea in our first reading today. So I think now we should basically do our first reading together. Listeners, you can find that first reading on page 14 of your July magazine. We're actually just going to look at the left-hand column, which is a very short one-paragraph reading, but we'll do that together to start off now.
Healthy habits that lead to success. Time management according to Buffett and Gates, plus insight into the ways mentally strong women think. Warren Buffett taught Bill Gates a simple way to manage time. The higher up you are on the leadership ladder, the tougher it can be to manage your time. Employees believe there is more freedom at the top. It is the opposite, as the impact of your decisions and the demands on your time are exponentially higher.
Okay, and so in that reading, we basically touch upon a lot of the different things we had in our discussion. We start with the sentence, the higher up you are on the leadership ladder, the tougher it can be to manage your time. And I just mentioned that right before we went to the reading, where we were talking about how people who are successful tend to be busy.
And I like this reference to a ladder. Here they call it the leadership ladder. But you'll often hear people talk about climbing the corporate ladder, and they're kind of referencing that there, that you have this idea that if you get into a big corporation, you're going to start at a lower level. And for people who are career-minded and success-driven, they're going to hope to be going up the ranks, getting promoted again and again, and we have this mental picture of a ladder, and that's what comes up here. That's what's being referenced.
That's right. And then we move on to the next sentence, and it kind of gives us some insight into the way a lot of people feel about the wealthy or successful people. The feeling here, they say, is that those people have more freedom. And so you might believe they are spending their time by the pool, but you might also think they can just kind of choose to do the jobs they want to do and give the jobs they don't want to do to other people.
Or maybe you think, well, they don't have to clock in at a certain time. Once you get to a certain level, you're salaried, so you don't have set hours. And for maybe people who aren't paying really close attention, it might feel like those people are working less because they're not coming in at the same time you are and doing those different things. Although, reality is most people who are going to continue to move up the ranks, who are really success driven, are probably working very long hours. Maybe the reason they didn't come in at 8 o'clock in the morning is because they were up till midnight working on projects or who knows what. But you can look like from the outside, if you're not observing really closely, that these are people who don't have to care about what time they go to work, what time they leave. They don't have very many bosses. Nobody's paying attention to what they do. It seems like a very free, easy situation.
But that feeling is completely wrong, as we find out in the third sentence, where it tells us that the opposite is actually true. And they say here, as the impact of your decisions and the demands on your time. Okay, so that's two things they're talking about. The impact of your decisions, obviously, if you are higher up in the company, your decisions will affect more people, more customers, different things. And so there's a lot more responsibility there. And as a result, there are a lot more demands on your time. And so they explain that with this phrase, exponentially higher. When something is exponentially higher, what does that mean?
It means that it's significantly higher and that over time it increases. That impact increases.
Yeah. So for those of you who aren't math fans, basically the idea is that instead of going up like 2, 4, 6, 8, things increase much more quickly, like 2, 4, 8, 16, 32. Right? So things increase more and more quickly as you take more and more responsibility. That's the idea. So the point here being that people who are successful do tend to be very busy, and they do need to have good ways to manage their time. Now, this is actually, if you are looking at your magazine, readers, you will see that there is a little quote there, and it's the first hint of Bill Gates and Warren Buffett in this magazine. It's actually a quote from Bill Gates. Would you mind reading it for us, Manya?
Sure. Bill Gates said, "It's not a proxy of seriousness that you filled every minute of your schedule."
Okay, now this quote, even for me, when I looked at it the first time, it took a couple of looks to figure out what he's saying, because Bill Gates, of course, is a very smart guy. And to understand this quote, you really need to know what a proxy is. Can you tell us what a proxy is?
I'm going to tell you my impression of it, and you're going to tell me if it's the most accurate, okay? So it's not one and the same. It's not a substitute, or, you can't, if you see that somebody has a busy schedule, that doesn't mean for sure that they're a very serious business person. It's not a one-for-one.
Well, that was a good explanation of the entire quote, really, what he's sort of saying. A proxy itself, though, is just someone who represents you or like serves in your place. Like maybe if you can't go to a meeting, you send someone as your proxy to sort of go to the meeting for you. And so the idea here is that it is not a proxy of seriousness, meaning it doesn't show how serious something is by filling every minute of your schedule. So the idea is that we know that people who are higher up on the ladder are very busy. We know that there are a lot of demands on their time, but that doesn't mean that they have to schedule every minute of the day to show how high up on the ladder they are. Being busy doesn't necessarily mean having a full schedule. I guess that's basically the idea. Are we agreed on that?
Mm-hmm.
Great. Yes. Oh, phew, what a relief. Well, that brings us to our second reading, and this is where we get into this idea of what Bill Gates learned from Warren Buffett. Now, I'm not sure if all of our listeners are familiar with this idea and these two, but of course they are quite well known for having a fairly close relationship. They're two people in the United States that were very wealthy and very influential at about the same time, but Warren Buffett is considerably older than Bill Gates. And so Warren Buffett seems to have had a lot of influence on Bill Gates over the years. For example, Warren Buffett was one of the first people who decided he was going to give away his fortune. When he dies or moves on, he's going to make sure that his fortune goes to good use in the service of all of humanity. And he started this program, a giving pledge, where people promised to do the same thing with their fortunes. And one of the early people to accept this idea and agree to do the same thing was Bill Gates. And Bill Gates has very famously started a foundation with his wife called the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation that basically focuses on ways to use charitable donations very, very efficiently. So they've looked at ways where they can spend small amounts of money to make the biggest amount of difference. And they've tended to basically invest their charitable giving in changing the world in all kinds of positive ways. And so there's definitely a connection between these two where a lot of advice has been passed. And you might even call that a mentor sort of relationship where Warren Buffett has kind of mentored or given advice to Bill Gates over the years. Though I'm sure it kind of goes back and forth both ways. Bill Gates is a very bright guy as well. So let's have a look at that second reading there. It's under the title, What Bill Learned from Warren, and it's in the right-hand column in page 14. We're going to read right down to the end of the section. So let's do that now.
What Bill Learned from Warren. In an interview with Warren Buffett and Bill Gates, Buffett shows his business calendar. It is nearly blank. Gates says this is one of the biggest things he's learned from Buffett. I had every moment packed, thinking that was the only way you could do things. The fact that he is so careful about his time, he has days there's nothing going on. Nothing, of course, doesn't mean a Buffett vacation day. It gives him space for thought, for strategy, and for flexibility. Gates continued, There's one big thing you miss in your overscheduled day: opportunity. While it may feel good flitting from one meeting to the next, wiser entrepreneurs actually allow space for the unexpected client, epiphany, or pivot. Think of it like leaving room in your coffee mug for cream and sugar. You don't want to have a completely empty cup, but you do want to provide space for more. And we wonder why we have all these ambitions, yet are in the same place months or even years later. There needs to be room for you to pursue them. How can new avenues be reached if you don't give yourself space to move forward?
So our reading here, and it is our longest reading by far for this lesson, it begins with an interview where both of these guys, Warren Buffett and Bill Gates, are being interviewed together at the same time. And during this interview, Warren Buffett showed his business calendar. Now, when we say his business calendar, we're really talking about like his schedule or his day planner book. We're showing what he's doing during the day to show how busy he is. And the thing that's interesting about it is it's nearly blank. Like he doesn't have a lot of things marked down, checklists and all kinds of things to do.
Yeah, this is surprising because you would expect there to be a lot of different meetings, right? You think of people at a high level or having a lot of meetings with a lot of different people. It's kind of mind-boggling to think that it really could be mostly blank.
Yeah, and this is actually where we get into the big tip, the focus of the article, because when Warren Buffett shows his day planner to the interviewer, Bill Gates chimes in and says that this empty day planner idea is one of the biggest things, the biggest tips he's learned from Warren Buffett. And then he continues on with a bit of quote in which he explains how this was a big tip for him. Manya, can you tell us, what did Bill Gates say?
Bill Gates said that he had every moment packed because he thought that that was the only way you could do things. But the fact that Warren Buffett is so careful about his time, and he has days where nothing's going on.
So this was a huge switch, and I think that's the point, is that there was a time when Bill Gates was doing things totally different, and the way that we would normally think of a very high-level executive, where your day planner is completely full of meetings and checklists and all these things that you have to get done. He was doing that, what most people do at that level, I would assume. And then he meets Warren Buffett and realizes that he has a whole different way of doing things.
It's interesting because one of the big things I have learned over the course of my career, that it really helps you to be able to account for your time. Meaning if if you are an employee and you are able to explain what you are doing with your time in great detail, it saves a lot of trouble. But it's interesting because I guess as you move up the ladder, you don't really have anyone you have to account that time for. Instead, you have to account for your performance, right? And so being able to show a list of tasks you have done is less important than being able to show a list of things you have achieved. And so it's interesting how this is kind of maybe suggesting that there's a shift in thinking at some point as you move up the ladder.
And I guess the amount of time that it takes to move up that ladder and the amount of skill and talent that it's taken would kind of predicate that you're probably the kind of person that has become very good at managing your time and getting things done and holding that space, so you don't necessarily need to write it all down and be constantly checking it. And that maybe you've moved yourself into this other side where your error is going to be to fill it up too much, which is what he's going to talk about. But I have to remind myself that that's kind of the progression those people have gone through, because if I don't make a long list of all the things I need to get done and really think through my time and when I can get what done, I will get barely anything done. Like, I really need that for my own time management process to motivate myself and give myself a good structure. But maybe what he's saying is at this level, you're probably not at that, you don't have that need anymore, and you've kind of moved into this other zone where you're probably doing that too much and maybe leaning on it too hard.
So there are two things I would add to that, Pauline, just as we discuss this. Like, one of the things is that when you're looking at a schedule, it's not necessarily the same thing as looking at a checklist of things you have to do, right? And
That's
so
true.
Some people like to keep checklists of how they're going to do things kind of in their minds. Other people like to write them down and things. But having an empty schedule really just means you haven't assigned a specific piece of time, like this half hour, to doing a specific job. So, and they go on to clarify that in the third paragraph, where they say, of course, nothing doesn't mean that Warren Buffett is on vacation. He's actually working and doing a lot of things. It's just he hasn't separated his time out into small blocks where he's telling himself, okay, you have to do this thing during this time. Instead, he's given himself a lot more freedom to schedule the different things he's doing. So I guess if he's got a number of projects sort of outlined in his mind or maybe written down, like things he wants to be working on, different priorities for the day, and he's making good progress with one thing, then there's no real reason to stop working on it and switch to something else if that other thing maybe isn't as important. And I guess what you don't want to do is be writing it down and then sticking to the schedule no matter the cost.
Rigidly, sure.
Right? Mm-hmm. Because that's the sort of thing you would do if you want to have an answer prepared when your boss says, "What did you do this morning?" Right? Because you want to have a good answer prepared. But if you're a person who is never going to be asked that question, and instead you're going to have a meeting once a year where people are like, you know, where's the money? You kind of want to be able to answer that in a different way. So as we continue on into the fourth paragraph, we see that Bill Gates continued, there is one big thing you miss in your overscheduled day. Now, Manya, what is that thing you miss when you put too much on your schedule?
Opportunity.
Okay, now how does that work?
If your schedule is full, then you never have room for any unexpected clients or revelations or any kind of changes.
Okay, so you don't have the flexibility to take advantage of opportunities when they come up, right?
There's really interesting studies out there about that, where people who are super busy, who are running late for things, they'll like walk right by somebody who is maybe is having a heart attack, or, you know, like all these where it's not because they don't care, like literally don't see them. And while that's kind of like the negative side, it's that idea that when you're in this like almost panicked, like must go from this to this, you're hurried and rushed, you're not like noticing the world around you as much. You're not open to what's going on, taking in information and responding to opportunities in the situations that arise in the day.
And if I can add on to that, it kind of is false significance sometimes. Because you see your schedule and it's so packed, you just think, oh, I'm doing a whole lot of things, but you're sometimes missing out on a lot of other things.
And they actually give you a list of the kinds of opportunities you might be missing out on here. They say, for example, you might be missing out on an unexpected client because you don't have time to talk to a person or spend some time with them. An epiphany, which basically means like a bright new idea. You might say a revelation, or a pivot, and that basically means changing to a different set of like a different plan or a different set of priorities, things like that. Just a big change in what's going on in the day. So they also provide us in this paragraph with a reason for why people might be jamming their schedules full. They say it feels good to flit from one meeting to the next. Now, flitting, that's an interesting word. Pauline, you like things that flit.
That's true. He says that because we often use this word for butterflies or like any kind of flying, small, light.
Like little hummingbirds, things like that, right?
Exactly. So the idea of moving quickly, lightly from thing to thing, but you're not stopping to like fully be present to anything. And they're saying, you know, it might feel good. Like it gives you this false sense of importance. Like Manya was saying that you're getting all this stuff done and you're going from place to place and doing this. But are you really making profound headway on major projects or these things that are the bigger goal than the small little meeting checklist kind of thing?
Okay. They give us a great example of what they're talking about here. They say
it's like a metaphor, right?
Yeah, that's right. They go on to give us this example of a coffee mug where they say when you're getting a cup of coffee, you don't fill the coffee cup so full of coffee that if you try to add cream or sugar, it will spill over, right? And so you fill the coffee so there's something in it, but you leave space for more when you want to add more to it. And I guess that's the idea. So you don't want to fill your schedule so full that you can't add more things to it. What a nice illusion. And then they go on and they say, we wonder why we have all these ambitions and we're working on these things, but we aren't really able to accomplish anything even after months. So how can new avenues be reached, they say, if you don't give yourself space to move forward? What a good idea. We have one more paragraph to read. It's at the very bottom of the right-hand column. Let's have a quick look at it now.
Understanding the time commitment. Essentialism author Greg McKeown says we tend to underestimate how long something will take to get done, especially when it is an outside request. It can be tough to say no, but it becomes a lot easier when we actually know the commitment required.
So at the very end here, we have another tip pegged on from another author, Greg McKeown, I believe that name is. And basically what this writer is saying is that we sometimes underestimate how long things will take. And so the idea being that if we cram our schedule full, we're not really able to finish things as quickly as we might like to. Now, listeners, thank you for joining us as we've talked about Bill Gates and Warren Buffett today. Tomorrow, we're going to be talking about 5 things that strong people know. So be sure to join us as we continue with our leadership lesson tomorrow. Until then, I'm Simon.
I'm Manya.
And this is Pauline.
Saying goodbye.
Goodbye.